Europeans have voted, and the setup of the new parliament is now clear. And I want to start here our first CLEW European Press Club with a little bit of good news to start with. It seems that the voter turnout has been at its highest in nearly 30 years since the enlargement of the EU, which, well, let's take it as a good sign that Europe matters. But we've come here together to look into what the results actually show. What do they tell us about voters' views on energy and climate policy? How will the results shape the future of the Green Deal at the heart of EU's energy and climate policy? And ultimately, will Europe stay on course to become the first climate neutral continent by 2050? Again, welcome to the first Clean Energy Wire Press Club. I'm Sven Egenter, the founder and editor-in-chief of CLEW, since we started in 2014 to look into, championing journalism to tackle the climate challenge. The questions the election results have created are at the very heart of our work at the Clean Energy Wire. That's why we have collaborated with journalists across Europe and actually the globe to connect the dots and to create a picture that allows for better connected energy transition and climate policy through the right information base, through an appropriate coverage, ultimately for a faster and fairer move to climate neutrality. And today, this is our very first time we actually share our work as journalists with a wider audience. And helping me to do so are three great colleagues who worked with us and been in the CLEW network for quite some time to help us all make sense of what the European elections, the results mean in the various countries, but also for the EU as a whole. So joining me today is Emanuela Barbiroglio, who is the EU Climate and Energy Policy Correspondent at Carbon Pulse, carbon market information service and news agency based in Brussels. Thank you for joining us, and apologies straight away for not getting the name straight, which is a classic when you do the first, but here we go. And to make things more difficult, I would like to introduce Patryk Strzałkowski, the climate reporter at Gazeta.pl, which will help us to understand what the results in Poland mean for the country's own energy and climate policy, and its often rather difficult relationship with the decision makers in Brussels. So Patryk, welcome to you in Warsaw. And finally, a colleague who's, will have a little bit more to explain than we thought she would have, in all fairness. Our freelance colleague, Juliette Portala, who's also part of the CLEW Dispatch From network, where we cover the energy and climate policy developments from across Europe. Clearly, France would have been an important player to watch in this EU election, but with President Macron calling new elections, which will happen in early July, we'll have a few extra questions for you, Juliette. And I ultimately will also add a few words on Germany, depending on also where the discussion goes with you, the audience. Because we're really keen to get your views, your comments, but also your questions into our discussion. So after, two rounds among the four of us, we'd like to invite you to post comments and questions in the Q&A part of the Zoom chat, ideally providing us with your name and your organization, and my colleagues Boris and Julian in the background will sort of help me and us to get to those questions. Finally, please be aware then that we are recording this conversation because I think we really all want to look back on what has been said. Now, as I've said, Europe has voted, and I would like to start with Emanuela, because you're in Brussels. You slept not too much, I've heard, last night. As somebody covering EU climate and energy policy, that seems almost a given. Maybe you could give us a sense of the mood right now in Brussels, and explain a little bit to us, what the interpretation is you're seeing and hearing on the ground in Brussels. And I will also put up a little chart for those who haven't seen the latest results. So we had just a quick glance, but Emanuela, what's the situation in Brussels right now?
Hi Sven, hello everybody, good afternoon. Thank you for having me. Yeah, so indeed we stayed up quite late yesterday, and we had like the last provisional results around 1 a.m. and then some of us stayed until 3. So yeah, it was a bit of exhausting evening, but yeah, actually results were pretty much as expected. With the EPP coming out as the winner of these EU elections, and somehow von der Leyen, being, we could say, relieved about what happened, but at the same time, really, she would have to understand how to form a majority, because of course none of the party right now has it. So it's a matter of forming a coalition. And immediately after the results, the Spitzencandidate spoke, Ursula von der Leyen among them, and she kept repeating that what's important for her is to have a broad coalition, meaning that she wants to ally with other parties being also pro-European, pro-Ukraine, and pro-rule of law. So to form something which represents democracy and what has been done so far in the EU. There wasn't much mention of climate, to be honest, but in the end, I personally, and also some of experts I spoke with, think that the Green Deal will really be the key item to form a coalition, because everybody would need to agree around that for different reasons. Maybe we could explain that later, but yeah, this is the result. And I would say, yeah, the Greens had a bit of fall comparing to 2019, when we had the climate vote for real, just after Fridays for Future and Greta Thunberg protests and so on. That was really the time when climate was expected to be the main item in the agenda, but it still is, just of course with Germany and France losing many Green MEPs, the Green had this sort of crisis, and ECR on the other end, so conservatives, the Conservatives group had a huge increase. But again, there's not like a clear majority yet, so it's really a matter of seeing what the EPP will decide to do.
Yeah, let me just follow up. I mean, we will go into the future later once we've done that round. But one question that has come up in the conversations here in Berlin, where obviously the Greens are seen as one of the main losers, in all fairness, of these EU elections. The question is, they've not been part of the von der Leyen coalition, if you want, in the last parliament, if you want. And, for those viewers from across the Atlantic, it means bearing in mind that, or it's important to bear in mind that the way, the European Union works is a little bit more complicated than a national government, yet still, I guess, it's not that far off. You have a parliament that ultimately will have to decide on the commission president, but who will be proposed by the European Council and then the question is which parties sort of throw their weight and which sort of sections of parliament will throw their weight behind the commission president. So what's your first feeling, your first instinct, what you're hearing, what you're seeing? Might this be an option for the Green section of the European Parliament to actively support a centrist center-right commission president?
Yes, I mean, when we asked this question yesterday night to Bas Eickhout, who's the main candidate, the Spitzencandidate for the Greens, he said he would be willing to form a coalition as long as ECR and ID especially, so the far-right parties, are not in it. Von der Leyen, on the other hand, didn't really speak so much about that. So we may think that that's the most likely option, really, even if it's not what happened before, but that would be probably the only way to make the Green Deal survive, yeah, to have eventually a not so right parliament in Europe. But again, yeah, to give just a bit of background, they have basically the whole summer to come up with, yeah, to decide which MEPs goes where, and then choose the new commission, so the new commission president as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting, and I'm sure we'll follow up on that in the course of our discussions. Patryk, let me turn to you. I mean, talking about handling the role of a sort of more right-wing populist party, and in the case of Poland, a government has been a big story over the past few years, which has changed with the recent Polish government, with a new government that has been hailed, at least in European circles, as a clear shift in the way things are going now. Maybe, and the big question out there, we had that in our conversation in the run-up to this press club, was how's that really playing out now that the Tusk government has to go to sort of like to the polls ultimately, and get a first test from voters. Maybe you can describe a little bit what the situation looks like in Poland now, which some say is a little bit different than the main story that has been portrayed across Europe of a surge or rise in the far right and in the populists in general.
Yeah, so Donald Tusk's Civic Coalition came in first, and I guess this will be the main story out of Poland that you see in other European media in Brussels, because obviously Tusk is seen as this big figure who defeated the populist right last year. So it's a positive story for a change, and also it's I can say it's quite interesting not to be the interesting one in a bad way on the European scene. But of course, when you look exactly at the election results, the story is way more complicated. It's definitely a loss for peace, law, and justice, who ruled Poland for 8 years. And actually, even though they lost power last year, it's they came in first in the previous parliamentary election in October. Now it's the first time in 10 years that they came in second. So it's in terms of image, it's definitely a defeat. But as you can see on the election result, it's a very close one. It's just 100,000 votes difference between Civic Coalition and Law and Justice. So it's not a stunning defeat. There was a feeling of it because of the exit polls showed a much bigger difference between these two. And if you consider that well, PiS is a populist right party, and then on the first spot you have a far-right Confederacja, who will send 6 MPs to the European Parliament. Together they are quite well, they're not in a coalition, but these two are, it means that the far right, the populist right, did get actually a pretty high result in the Polish election after all. And also the two coalition partners of Donald Tusk's party, the left and the centrist Third Way, they did quite poorly, losing quite a significant number of votes of voters compared to the parliamentary election. So it's a mixed view for the current government. They didn't get overwhelming support from the people, but also it's not a rebuttal of the government. And it's I would say that they can see it as a warning sign that the majority that they have, it's not very certain. It could be fragile. If we had a parliamentary election this year, it's not going to be in Poland unless something happens. There won't be another election until 2027. But if the election were to be held this year, the Donald Tusk's coalition, they would not be certain to hold on the majority.
Yeah, I mean, thank you, Patryk. I mean, I'll take your words that, we should not on a European level expect Poland to become all of a sudden the driver of a ambitious energy and climate policy. At a long time, there has been have been views, that Poland has been an energy transition laggard. I mean, today we've got a report saying, or the English version of a report from Forum Energy that seem to indicate that this has been not even in the past under the old auspices not as simple a story either. Now, would you? I mean, it's one thing to look into what the Polish government under Tusk will do on a Poland level in Poland, but if we're not talking about what the ambition level and the sort of action level in Europe's going to be, maybe do you have already a feeling where this might be going? How will they balance this act, Brussels versus politics back home in Poland?
Yep. Yeah, so I would say it's definitely gonna be a change from the previous government, but not Poland will not become a climate leader in Europe, especially not in terms of new targets, of new legislation. I think for the next couple of years for Poland, it will be all about implementation. And this is also what we hear the politicians from the ruling coalition saying, that what we need to do now is focus on implementations, on law that will allow for a more robust implementation on renewables, that we have to decide what to do with the coal plants and the coal mines, that we're really lagging behind on infrastructure for electric vehicles. So like really there will be a focus on implementation, and I would say hesitancy towards new targets and new laws and new legislation to be put forward. I think Poland, the Donald Tusk government, well, they're clearly pro-European, so they can be expected to be more of a partner for discussion, but they will not be a new leader in implementing or putting forward new targets. Like, for example, when I think about the setting of the 2040 targets, well, it's impossible to say whether Poland will support it or not, but definitely it won't be very enthusiastic about it and even about the whole discussion.
Yeah, I mean, mooted enthusiasm about anything that has to do with a change in the energy, or any change actually, right now seems to be a common theme, at least in some of the Central European countries. That question, has been obviously very, fiercely discussed in Germany as well. I'll come to that in a second. But, as we call it at the Clean Energy Wire in general, we seem to be in the age of implementation and what all that entails in terms of energy and climate policy. So more ambition seems to be a harder and harder sell in general. Juliette, looking at France, I mean, talking about the appetite for change, that raises a whole lot of questions when you look at the election results in France at the moment. Maybe you can help us make some sense both about the current outcome, the mood in the country, and what the media portrays this, and obviously against that. At least it was for me a surprise move by Emmanuel Macron. I guess for a lot of other people as well, but you tell me.
Yeah, a lot of appetite even. More than 31% for Marine Le Pen's party, the Rassemblement National, or National Rally in English, led in the EU election by Jordan Bardella, the name to remember. This scored more than double the number of votes of President Emmanuel Macron's camp. Or like Politico wrote it, the far right obliterated Macron's camp. But that was not a surprise. I mean, the polls had given us a pretty good sense of what to expect. What was more of a surprise, and I felt from everyone, is that before even official results were in, Macron decided to dissolve the French National Assembly and announced early legislative election. I think it hadn't been done in something like 25 years. He said, at the end of the day, I couldn't pretend like nothing had happened. I'm thinking with the polls, he expected a pretty heavy defeat, so he probably had thought of his options beforehand. Plus, I mean, right now he doesn't even have a majority at the National Assembly. So in the press, this was a shock election move for The Guardian. Le Soir in Belgium reminded that dissolutions were a double-edged sword. It's true that it's been done before by Charles de Gaulle, Mitterrand, Chirac. It did not always go well for all of them. Well, Chirac mostly. The New York Times expects a period of deep political uncertainty in France. Der Spiegel mentions a dramatic twist in Forblick in Switzerland. Worse than that, Macron is taking Europe hostage. Because it's true that here, he made no difference between voting for the EU and voting for France in some way. He could have, for instance, just be appalled by the result and then maybe give a chance to the Olympic Games in Paris this summer to just, you know, blow the whole thing off and maybe just take people's mind off politics. So I think it's a way for him, well, first to admit the defeat, but also his last shot at proving that this outcome may not be representative of what the French think of the presidency. Like Libération said, it's more of an extreme gamble. We'll see. I think it's a bit early to tell. And for the Rassemblement National supporters, he shot himself in the foot. That's pretty clear. Bardella, he had repeatedly during the campaign said that he was going to require the dissolution. So we were expecting Macron at some point maybe to react. He has already been designed by his party as the one that would run for the Prime Minister's office if the far right was getting a majority in the National Assembly. And I think this dissolution for the far right, the fact that they called for it so many times, it's probably to capitalize on the lack of popularity of Macron's party, but also to show that, like, to assert the Rassemblement National's credibility as an alternative to Macron for the presidential election that will take place in 2027. Mm-hmm. They no longer want to be just an anti-establishment party. And obviously, maybe a few words on the left that's kind of panicking now. Despite a solid third place for the socialists led by Raphael Glucksmann, he said in a speech last evening, very quickly, thanked everyone, but then said, okay, there isn't much to celebrate given the far right score. Philippe Lambert with the Green, I'm citing BBC here, he appealed to everyone, conservative, social democrats, liberal, to steer clear of embracing the flavor of the far right. And the far left with Manuel Bompard, they already asked for a gathering this afternoon. So maybe right now they are currently thinking of some coalition or cooperation.
I mean, it's thank you for that. I mean, we can only try to appreciate how difficult it might be to sort now, you know, what's actually going on. And you mentioned that obviously even the sort of opposition politicians don't really know what you know, to make out of that. And apparently I read that even within Macron's movement, that came as such a surprise that there were, you know, that people were shouting no when he announced it. I don't know whether that's true, but you know, given what you described, that sounds actually quite plausible. Now, the question really is probably very hard to answer right now. Maybe, you know, you give it a shot anyway. If you look at, you know, take it to this sort of European level and ask yourself, you know, what will be the sort of like fallout from your perspective on you know, Europe. Maybe you just give it a shot at this point in time, or is that too early to think about and we need to wait for the election results? It certainly doesn't make, you know, building any alliance in Europe easier, I would suspect.
Well, honestly, if we take the Green Deal, for instance, so Bardella, again, the one leading the EU campaign for the Rassemblement National, he said that the Green Deal was one of the biggest threats weighing on France today. That's quite bold. You have to give him that. I don't think they can get rid of it. I mean, there is so much unraveling that you can do. Apart from the agricultural side, where there is still a lot to discuss. Like Pascal Canfin said, he's one of the architects of the Green Deal and also a target for the farmers at the moment. On most measures, all the investments are already in place. Planification has already started. So I don't see any lasting blockage. Plus, and I'm happy to get back to that later, but they have like the far right has a lot of very different strategy against climate that are becoming more and more subtle. But I think it's not going to hold long, that strategy. So maybe I'm too optimistic here. I'm not sure, but yeah.
I mean, talking about being optimistic or not, you know, that leads me seamlessly to a quick view to Germany, which I will be present. We've been discussing, we started actually last night discussing by a chat with the colleagues about, you know, mostly sort of looking in a bit of, you know, it's not a shock. It's you know, it came almost as expected, but still you sometimes think that certain developments don't materialize the way they've been sort of predicted to materialize. And it's fair to say that, you know, the results we've seen, you know, there is no sugarcoating for anyone who works on an energy transition in the climate action space and who wants more ambition. The results, you know, of yesterday's election, the German results of the EU election were clearly putting a clear stop sign up. With mostly, I mean, it has been widely reported, the current government coalition, three-party coalition losing, largest drop in the Green Party share. And, you know, the most talked about and clearly most consequential rise is, you know, has been seen both with the right-wing populists, actually, the Alternative for Germany, AfD, you know, clearly, you know, the big talking point, but you know, usually I'm a glass half full, glass half empty person. So, but here, you know, there's a little bit of extra emptiness that doesn't get that much play because, you know, the second biggest winner, if you want, in terms of percentage share is the newly founded left populist party that in itself is not, you know, it's mostly nationalist with a sort of left-leaning policies when it comes to welfare or to social policies. But is also not exactly a supporting party for the energy transition. And it has to be said, you know, has also been lobbying for reopening ties on natural gas deliveries with Russia. So, you know, we're getting actually a pretty, that's the BSV on the chart I've put up. So we're getting here in Germany a clear shift where you can see a significant populist increase, and you know, and it, you know, actually to explain a little bit, you know, the setup of this, you know, what has, I think, internally in Germany from the domestic point of view, and that has been the focus of these elections, which has come as an even bigger shock, is the clear disparity now between Eastern Germany, you know, where the populist parties are now, you know, leading in all 5 federal states. 3 of them will have elections in fall, and the West, where, you know, we also had local elections in some federal states in the Southwest, but also in the East, and they could see that split as well. I don't, you know, we don't have the full results on the local elections, especially not from Baden-Württemberg, close to the French border, and from Rhineland-Pfalz, also bordering Luxembourg and France. But, you know, there you have still Green parties, for instance, you know, in the running for top spots in the big cities, on par with the Conservatives, which in Germany as a whole, you know, have taken, you know, the lead. Now, in terms of climate and energy policy, there's a lot of talk, and I think that's true for the whole of Europe, about, you know, voters turning against climate policies in general. And you know, that is not fully, you know, backed up by the sort of exit poll surveys that ask people, you know, what are your main concerns and why have you voted along the lines you've voted? And talking, and that will lead us to a question that I will also want to ask, you know, my colleagues in Germany. You know, the list has clearly shifted from 2019 top concern on the wake of the Fridays for Future movement being climate action to now being security concerns. Mostly it's immigration has been high up on the list, unsurprisingly. And the broader aspect of social policy welfare state questions, and then only in fourth spot, but still in fourth spot, and not that far off when you look at the percentage figures. Climate action, has come down a bit. But what really struck me was when people were asked about their long-term concerns. What are you really concerned about? Climate and the impact of climate change on their lives actually came still second in the list of concerns, followed a sort of more vaguish security concern, and that has been reflected actually throughout the election campaign. So to read the results as a sort of like, people have forgotten about climate action. At least, the numbers that we're seeing don't fully back that up. But with the current government now under pressure, with the local elections looming, and now obviously also important partner countries like France stuck in an election campaign, and then the fallout of that, that doesn't exactly bode well for any type of additional climate action policy under this current government. Now we have focused on the four of us, and we didn't want to make the panel too large, so we didn't invite our colleagues from Italy. But the good thing is that Emanuela, and that I want to hand over to ask a little bit of the question how the campaigning has played out in Brussels as well. And one person that has been talked a lot about in her role in the future on an EU level has been the Prime Minister of Italy, Ms. Meloni. So maybe, Emanuela, you could give us, from your sort of like dual role we've sort of assigned you to with your connections to your home country, give us a little feel, how has the Meloni government fared, and what could that mean, in terms looking to Brussels, and will she be the queen maker or the kingmaker, and what does that bode for energy and climate policy?
Okay, so yeah, Meloni and her Fratelli d'Italia was certainly another big winner of this election. So it's not really difficult to understand what will happen because, again, it's impossible, according to what they said, to have a coalition with both progressives, including left, SD, and the Greens, and on the other side, ECR, not to mention ID even. But her success is also at the same time undeniable. So it would be really difficult to form a coalition without totally excluding Meloni and ECR in general. But again, that's probably the most likely option to happen. Another thing that's probably worth mentioning is that the Italian PD was the SD party that got the biggest seats in the parliament. So that's a good thing for climate policies, let's say, also in particular because Elly Schlein, who's the leader of the PD in Italy, is one of the first leftish politicians in Italy who spoke openly about climate change and climate policies, and not just jobs or other economic vague topics. So yeah, that's important. But yeah, for a long time we spoke about Meloni as the king or queen maker, and that's something like a role that's been competed between her and the Greens. So we will see. It's a bit too early to say, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's obviously an interesting movement that has, even here in Germany, after there has been a bit of talk before the election, has now gone unnoticed into this whole question, what's happening here, and also with the experience, I have to say, of a sort of like the campaign has been also marred by, I don't know how that was in other countries, by an unusual type of aggression against politicians campaigning. We've seen this in other parts of Europe as well, obviously, in Denmark and in Slovakia in a very aggressive form. But also here in Germany, politicians have been attacked and while campaigning. Has that? I mean, how has the election campaign been watched from Brussels in the various member states? Has that gone noticed, or was it a real focus on where's that going to go and lead overall with the policy questions?
In a way, because the parties who came out as the winner of these elections, so in particular the far right, are nationalists and focus very much for their campaign on national issues. There was like a kind of discrepancy between what were the topics to discuss here in Brussels and what was the reasons why people voted for them in their in member states. So it's a bit weird actually to have like different topics really, and at the same time in Brussels the electoral campaign started already 1 year ago when the EPP started to work against the nature restoration law. All of a sudden a big part of the Green Deal, while actually the EPP was one of the makers of the Green Deal and all its pieces. So that was again something that came arrived like a surprise here in Brussels. But yeah, it's been happening for a whole year, and we had farmers protests and a lot of policies bits being attacked in this sense. So not only the nature restoration law, but also the common agriculture policies and other bills that were like stuck at the very last moment, like the bans on cars and other, and the EPBD for making like buildings more efficient. All these little bits are under attack, but what will happen most likely is that they will be slowed down rather than totally destroyed. It would be very difficult to destroy like 5 years of legislations like that. So as Juliette said, I'm also cautiously optimistic about the future of the Green Deal.
I mean, this seems to be a common theme now that, obviously more ambition seems in all, in France, in Poland, in Germany, not on the cards yet, a sort of rollback in the proper sense of the word does not to be, in store either. One question that, and I would like to invite, the people who are watching us again to throw in questions. One of the issues I've been asked actually when I announced this panel already by a colleague on LinkedIn, he says like, oh, where's this hatred against the Green Party coming from? Which I can only obviously talk about Germany, and I think in other countries, the situation is a different one. I mean, here we've had a sort of like long campaign that, if you will, stretched from the sort of discussion over this ill-fated and not particularly well-designed and communicated heating law right over into this year's election campaign, and where we've seen the sort of polarization, or at least an attempt to polarize things, across the parts of the political spectrum. Has there been, from your observation, if you look at the people and at the voters rather than at what politicians and parties say, what's your feeling, Patryk? Has there been a sort of active rejection or an increasing rejection of energy transition policies? I mean, you mentioned that this is now all about implementation, but what should we expect in Poland as a sort of way forward when it comes to the voters' reactions, the people's reactions to that?
Yep. So looking at the campaign, both right-wing populist parties, the big one, Law and Justice, and the extreme right Confederation, they had repealing the Green Deal as one of their main slogans. And obviously, it's hard to say from what we see from polling. It wasn't the main issue that drove people to vote on these parties. There's lots of other European and domestic issues, but I think well, what can be seen as a warning sign is that the attendance of the election in Poland was quite low. It was below. It was a 40%, like quite low, way lower, lower than the previous European election, way lower than the parliamentary election. But the extreme right Confederacy was the one party that kept most of its votes. Like the left had like almost 50% fewer votes, and the Confederation had over 90, like in terms of the number of voters who went out to vote, like the Confederation, they almost kept the scores from the parliamentary election. And I would say that this is a sign that campaigning on immigration as well, but on these issues, it can mobilize people. So the policymakers, the government in Poland, they have to really wait out the social aspects of the transition, really listen to the people, listen to the concerns, because of course there's a lot of misinformation as well. There is just some anti-EU sentiments and so on, but there are legitimate concerns that this kind of parties, they will try to exploit it and use it in their election campaigns. And when you like listen to what the people have to say, and I've attended, I reported from one of the protests against the Green Deal, and the people to whom I spoke, and quite a few of them were coal miners, or like people working in the mines, not in the mine themselves, but in the companies that own them. They were not completely against any environmental laws and so on, but they were afraid of the costs. They were susceptible to some misinformation as well. For example, there was one person who said that she's protesting because the EU is banning flying abroad. So you can see that this kind of misinformation is working. They were confused by some of the policies. Like, for example, to give you a short, but I think a really well example, in Poland still you can get a subsidy to replace an old coal furnace with a gas one. With one running natural gas, and then people hear that the gas furnaces will be banned in a few years with the EPBD. So this is like, for people who do not follow climate policy, this is like legitimately confusing and a big communication challenge, I would say, for the policymakers, for the media.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's obviously something, that I can, from our experience of the last year and a half, very vividly, confirm. We had the way certain things are portrayed and decisions are portrayed here. You do wonder why and how people came up with that. And then it's obviously a question. There are two questions you've raised. As one is like, where is sort of like certain type of misinformation coming from? I mean, we know the sort of obvious one where you, for political gains, use something, but there seems to be an undercurrent now that I find, it's difficult to sort of pin down, but it plays into certain stories. And the other thing is the role of the media, and that's obviously something that we have at heart, trying to sort of boil things down and look at what's actually going on and what is actually said. So yeah, that I can very vividly confirm that the risks that for political gains you use certain very simplistic lines that are peddled. That's something that we can see here very well. I mean, Juliette, the invention of popular protests, at least as far as I can tell, that has to go to France and the Yellow Vests movement at the time. Although we all know it was not, mostly, it was the trigger point, but it was not only about, the fuel price. What's your view now when you look at the campaign against what we've seen now in the elections and the way it was campaigned? give us a little bit of a feel what you expect, how the whole question of energy and climate will play out. I mean, France, obviously, as a major nuclear power producer, being in a slightly different situation than Poland and Germany when it comes to the question of, shifting to clean energy. But still, there are a lot of other questions. You mentioned agriculture. We can talk about buildings and the transport sector. What's your feeling? How will this play out now in the election campaigns from what you've seen just now in the EU elections?
Well, obviously the far right comes up again, because that's what's most scary, I think, for all French politicians here and maybe people who did not vote for them. The reason why maybe I'm actually still optimistic on energy and climate in particular is because the Rassemblement National as a strategy it's like climatal relativism. It means like presenting EU transition policies as detrimental to the quality of life of French people. But the thing is, they're not proposing any solution, any alternative solution. They're just undermining the foundations of the transition and then waiting on technical progress and innovations to do the rest. But in France, we've already seen that it was not enough. The state is planning on offering, or maybe has already offered, to buy flooded house in the north of France. You've probably seen houses being constantly flooded in that region. So houses that insurers no longer want to support, where people can no longer live. So France, because of climate change, is already losing money, insurance firms and business and people their homes. So the far right wants to be the voice of vulnerable people, but it's those same vulnerable people that end up being disproportionately harmed by climate change. And since we're in for worsening extreme weather events, a potential far right majority would sink, again, in my view, if it's objective to EU green policies. Plus, and I think maybe that's the most important thing here, there are recent surveys by EU institutions that have shown that French people still care about climate. They still think that it's climate and the environment is one of the top issues that the European Union should work on in the next few years. So it's really not that we no longer care. It's just that we were less convinced by the Greens, by politicians overall this year. But just like there are consequences to the climate changing, there are co-benefits to fighting it. Clearly the French know it. And again, maybe I'm too optimistic, but I do believe that even if the far right had, let's say, confused maybe a bit, had provided the wrong answer, it's not going to hold very long.
Yeah, I mean, this is the big question. When will the con be called? Yeah, on certain arguments, and obviously, if I may say, one of my biggest concerns always is that we'll see a shift from, climate action is not that important, to, well, yeah, it's happening and we need to do more on climate adaptation to make ourselves future-proof, and then you run into this sort of conflict of where do you spend the money on, and then you're getting a whole lot of different discussions there that is might complicate things further. I just want to invite, because we're heading into the last stretch of this round, if anyone out there has a question about any of the countries, about the context, either in Poland, France, Italy a little bit at least, and Brussels and Germany, just drop a line in the Q&A of the Zoom chat. Other than that, I'm turning to Emanuela again, because you already mentioned that we're now heading into this process of sorting things out and building a sort of, whether it's a von der Leyen coalition or whatever the coalition then will be. Then we also have the conversations among the member states on the setup of the future commissions and how that will progress. That's obviously a very, let's say, multifaceted process among member states and countries. if we just look at what Juliette has said about the French the elections in France coming up, and then obviously from a German perspective, they're also the two. It's only federal states, but still, it's something people will have an eye on. What would be your best guess? What to watch out next in the process in Brussels? And what timeline, is there any indication? I mean, it's obviously a little bit of guesswork, but that's what we try to take your experience and see where this might be heading, and what the rhythm might be we should be watching out for.
Yeah, so again, I really honestly think that the Green Deal could be the key element. And as I mentioned before, for different reasons, the EPP talked a lot over the past months about industrial competitiveness, and that's something that could be the next step of a Green Deal. Anyway, it's time to implement at a local and national level what's been decided over the past 5 years here in Brussels, and it's not time to go back to decisions that were taken already. Also because, again, as Juliette said before, we have all industrial sectors preparing for the timeline and the guidance that was given to them before, and it makes no sense now for investors to change completely and have a different deadlines, different goals. So we will really see that, given the pressure from international competitors like the US and China, the EU will need to focus a lot on its production and economic growth, and can really only do it in a realistic way if it's based on sustainable technology and protection of the environment too. So it cannot just keep producing energy, for instance, in an unsustainable way, or producing steel in an unsustainable way. So that's really, in my opinion, the next step of the Green Deal.
Yeah. I mean, it's a very interesting point. I attended the annual conference of the German Energy and Association, and it's sort of the biggest industry event just a few days back, actually, last week, with our economy minister Habeck and head of the opposition Friedrich Merz, both speaking there. And it was pretty clear that, none of these managers, and the CEOs were ready to sort of for any type of rollback. Obviously, they all have their varying preferences, how to go forward, and where to compensate and all that. But, it wasn't a feeling of, oh, yeah, let's go back to the olden days. And so, I mean, that's an interesting point, which is also leads me to another question. I've just seen the chart, Emanuela, when it comes to the sort of fallout of the election. I mean, as a former Reuters person, like Juliette, you will remember that as well. First thing you do is, what do the markets make out of the current election results? And the EU ETS as the carbon market, where the future climate policy is supposedly reflected by intelligent people, showcased immediately a drop in ETS price of a ton of carbon emissions. So how do you interpret that? Is that a sort of classic, sell on a certain type of news, or is that really investors going, in that case, people who invest or who trade in the carbon market going, yeah, okay, so now we can they're taking the foot off the accelerator. How is the interpretation in the carbon market there?
Oh, sorry, I thought the question was for Juliette.
No, sorry, I was just saying, she used to work for Reuters as well, so we both have that probably memory of checking back what the market said about a certain result. But you're much closer now because you're literally covering, or your colleagues do, the carbon market.
Yeah, so I think that everybody was quite happy for the ETS reform and the success of ETS. So now the prices are showing a little bit of a fallback, but that doesn't necessarily mean that things will change. Actually, the market expects ETS to keep working and respect the deadlines again. So there's even mention of an ETS free, including new sectors like agriculture. So that would be really difficult to apply. It's just people like talking about it for now. But yeah, I would say that what happens show still that ETS was a success and is working. So
yeah, what's your best guess? Will ETS2 and the inclusion of the emissions from the building sector and from transport sector, will it happen as planned, or is that a question mark now with the current situation?
It all depends on member states and their use of a social climate fund with the revenues in a way that really makes like EPBD and the efficiency of building something that's affordable for vulnerable people. Also because there's like this link now. Normally buildings that are in need of a renovation are exactly the buildings of people who experience energy poverty. So it's really necessary for governments to step up and show they can help, because that's exactly where the social climate fund should go. So
yeah, interesting. I mean, that leads me, I see that either our viewers are still too shy, not used to this sort of format, or they can't find the button to type in questions, or, we've all been so clear in what we've been saying that there are no further questions. I hardly believe that, but anyway, you always hope. So I would like to you can still post questions in the Q&A, but I want to do a final round, because those questions will not go lost if you even ask questions afterwards through the various channels at Clean Energy Wire. We will either distribute them to the panelists or answer to the best of our knowledge ourselves. Maybe we'll do a final round now, and Emanuela, you basically already gave the look ahead and what matters next. I mean, that would be my main question now for all of us, actually. What is the big story of the next 3-4 months when you look at energy and climate policy on a European level? And the links to your various national countries. Again, Emanuela, you've already answered the question about the ETS2 and the links to the sort of support funds. May I translate it like those for the social adjustments? Any other stories you would say, okay, that's worth really watching out because it's not clear where this is going, or it's really important?
In Italy, we also have the G7 and
True.
Meloni being again a very important actor in this process, which is really about international climate finance too. So we'll have to watch that. But I think another maybe just tiny detail about Italian politics is that for the first time in ages, we have Italian Greens again in the European Parliament. That's something that should be celebrated also because their victory is the percentage they got was much more than expected, with almost 7%. So I would say that's something also quite interesting to see in the future.
And now they come up with the big question at the end, how the ETS can be used to sort of in a unanimous way, to drive the Green Deal forward. I think that's a big question and a big answer potentially, which is nothing you're probably going to do in 30 seconds, or will you?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that. I mean, as long as the ETS only touches on big, heavy industries, it's easier to have a general support towards that. But again, when it comes to heating and cooling and road transport, which will be the next sectors in it, that's a hard question. But it's all about responsibility of member states, I think.
Yeah, that question was from Carlos Emanuela, and maybe he will discuss that with you on a different level. Or sign up to your own work at Carbon Pulse. Juliette, I mean, it's a big one, but what's the big story to watch out over the next few months? I mean, other than the general, it will be all about the election. What is it that matters now?
Yeah, so aside from the snap election, because I think it's a bit too soon to make guesses. I think what's going to matter in France is that French politicians need to make the ecological transition more desirable. And then ultimately, it's going to be accepted by all. And accompanying, especially financially, is going to be key to have everyone on board. It means consulting citizens. It means ensuring investments on a national level. Because if we are to give up sources of pleasure or polluting habits for the sake of climate, and us, obviously, it's only human to want to be rewarded of some sort by tangible results. But the problem, and I think that's particularly the case in France, is that the link between EU regulations and national implementation is sometimes a bit wobbly. Member states have some freedom for applying EU standards, but France, in my view, has always felt a bit too free. And we've seen it with the renewables. The French government is still in talks to avoid, with the European Commissions, to avoid penalties for failing to meet the EU binding targets for renewable share in 2020 and even after.
I mean, the first part obviously is something that I guess applies to many places, and maybe we should have invited somebody from the Nordics where things seem to be going much smoother and people are more happy. That's certainly something when we talk about the solution focus at Clean Energy Wire, we want to definitely look into more prominently. And we've been in touch now with our colleagues in Denmark and Sweden to see how that works out in societies like that. Not that there's everything okay there, but at least on that front, it seems much it looks more advanced, at least from where we are here in Berlin. Patryk, what's now the next big thing to watch out in Poland for? And as we're already slightly over time and we don't want to keep our viewers much more busy than we have.
So to touch a bit on what I mentioned before, I think the story to watch in the next month, next half a year is implementation, because there was the current government coalition. They did make some quite bold promises on environment protection, on the energy transition, and they haven't shown much yet. And well, of course, things take time, but there is a feeling, I guess, that some things were put on a hold until before the election. We also had the local elections back in April, and now the European ones, and the government might have been a bit afraid to put out things that would be controversial, like laws that will allow for more renewables to be implemented, like the climate plans for this and the next decades. So in the next months, we will see if the government comes forward with the new strategies, with the new legislation to actually implement what they promised, and what's in there, what's specifically in these bills and in these strategies.
Yeah. Well, excellent. And that's a perfect handover to thank the three of you for your insights and to thank our audience for joining for this first press club. Again, let us know, now that you didn't have that many questions, what you would like to discuss in the future, how we've done and how we could sort of make that more useful for everybody. On beyond that, the invitation is obviously out. Clean Energy Wire, aims to sort of connect the dots across Europe in these types of formats, either written or in joint activities. So on all the questions about the future being raised, we'll try to stay on top of that with the help of our contributors and the wider network that we have. Again, thank you everyone for joining. And on that note, I hope that we'll get clarity over the future of the EU Commission and what it all means for energy and climate policy sooner rather than later. But it's fair to say it's going to be an interesting road ahead on these questions. And on that note, I would say we end our first CLEW Press Club. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.